So today, let's chat about research. There's a lot of great research that happens at universities, but it takes forever for that research that gets into publications to actually get into practice. I know you guys have been in this field for a while. Help us understand like what happens to amazing research? Why does it take forever to get to market? And maybe before getting into that, maybe Daniel, you can talk about what does a normal process look like right now for something to be published and then actually used in clinical practice? Because I feel like there's a huge delta time-wise between publication of really interesting research and its application into clinical practice. Daniel, just give some education on to our public audience here.
Yeah, couple good points. There definitely is a delay from when stuff gets published to when we can analyze it, translate it, put it into practice with our patients, at least in the physical therapy setting. I do think that's gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. There's more, as much as we might not like at times things like social media, and that can cause like some confusion. There's also more access to people posting about their research and bringing it to the forefront. And now you are starting to see stuff that was published in 2024, 2025, and being brought into the clinic. But there still is a little bit of a delay in making sure that that research is feasible in your setting, the ways that it was maybe data collected, if we're talking about sports performance testing or strength or jumping and all kinds of different stuff. This could be super broad, but to make sure that the way that that research was collected matches your setting, your population, and your resources is a little bit of a challenge. But I will say that that process has gotten a little bit faster over the years. And then there's a lot of different ways that that research can go from publication to being in front of clinicians' eyes. I mentioned social media has expedited that a lot. People, seems like everybody has a podcast these days, is talking about their most recent stuff. So some really good, I just want to highlight, Mick Hughes is doing a new podcast recently on a lot of things, sports performance and ACL rehab and all kinds of stuff like that. I'm really trying to bring some of these to the forefront. So look for stuff on podcasts. Um, and then kind of the old tried and true methods are physical therapists and other people going to continuing education courses, which we have to do every couple of years and make sure that our licenses and stuff are up to date. And that is traditionally a little bit slower method to get some of the stuff that's being published into the hands of the clinicians, but potentially a little bit more vetted as well. So some downsides in terms of speed, but upsides in terms of maybe someone's already gone through and handpicked some stuff for you. So super broad, but a couple challenges of how it gets to our feet.
Gotcha. Shayna, you've been on the performance side, on the professional side of athletics, and you've also seen the physical therapy side of it. Do you see a difference in the rate of adoption of research and the transcription of that into practice, when you look at professional sports versus regular physical therapists? Do you see a delta there?
Yeah, definitely. Professional sports has a bit of a different setup because they are creating their own databases with all athletes that they've had on their team. And these databases can date back a long period of time. So it's really easy for them to do research themselves and do research that's very specific to their team, to their sport. They can even look at things like how was our training different from when this coach was here versus when this coach was here? How does changing one thing in our practice change the workload that we're experiencing on our team? So definitely very different from physical therapy because they have an abundance of data they can pull from that's super specific to them. Physical therapy definitely takes a bit longer, like Daniel was just talking about. I think one of the biggest things is time. It takes a lot of time to sort through all these research articles to find something that is relevant to your population. And I mean, I've experienced this too after like reading two full articles. I'm like, oh, well, like that's enough for today. Like, let me pick this up tomorrow because it gets kind of exhausting. So definitely big discrepancy between the two. And then also research for physical therapists like probably costs money. CEU course costs money. Having like a subscription to a journal costs money. And depending on what clinic or what company you're working with, they may or may not help with that. So huge difference between professional sports and physical therapy.
You bring up a really interesting point, Shayna. One is that you can either take research and translate that into clinical practice, or you can develop your own in-house research, quote unquote. Um, a lot of trainers and practitioners, especially in the sports side, have their own, shall we say, art of doing things, their own recipes of what works and what doesn't work, and they can be very hyper specific on that. Um, on the physical therapy side, it seems like there's maybe less of that, or maybe there's an equal amount. I'm not sure, Daniel. I'm trying to figure this out. But do most physical therapists, like in the professional side, do they have this art of physical therapy that they practice, and do they then kind of create a culture of research within their clinic, or are most physical therapists just dependent upon what's published, and do they kind of follow that line of thought? Is if it's published, then I'll use it, or do they self co-create their own research within their clinics?
Certainly a mix there, but I do think that there's a lot less of the standardized data collection and internal research that Shayna is talking about in professional sports. Um, I think has been super rare in outpatient physical therapy, and much harder to do. You have data scientists and people like Shayna who can work for pro sports teams, who sit down and analyze this data and have spent years doing their masters and such things. So it's pretty rare to find that in outpatient physical therapy, in my opinion. What I will say is you mentioned a little bit about kind of the art of physical therapy as well, and we're always taught that research is so important and follow this and do that. And I think a bunch of PTs are doing that process of internal kind of looking at their research, but it's much less standardized. It's just kind of drawing on their experiences from what worked with the last patient and those kinds of things. And we're taught to think about like an evidence-based triangle. And one thing that is one tip of that triangle is the latest research and what that stuff has been telling you in good quality. One part of that triangle is the practitioner's own experience and what's worked with their patient population before. And then the third part of that triangle is your patient's values and your patient's they're bringing to the table, their preferences, their specific scenarios, and those kinds of things. So you might have something that's truly backed by the most recent article and you really want to do it, and your patient doesn't buy into it at all. It's not part of what they want to do. And that's where the culture piece comes into it, and the art of physical therapy comes into it. You gotta Each of those tenets, I think, are all equally important. And you got to be able to address the latest research, but then fit that to the current scenario in front of you and consider all three of those points.
Yeah, I gotcha. It seems like in professional sports, you have a more of a baseline population. You have people that are very athletic, that fit a certain profile. So it must be a lot easier to develop research within that group and implement it, because the variability in the patient population probably is not as great as there is in a physical therapy clinic. And you're also seeing the same individual sports personality for a long time consistently. So it's the consistency of visits and the kind of the consistency of the population group in terms of their physicality. Shayna, do you think that aids in creating these micro ecosystems of R&D within a team that perhaps aren't as easy to develop at a clinic?
Yeah, definitely. That's a huge part of it. I mean, to give some context into how often we would collect data, we would collect data every day out on the field or court, and then we'd collect data in the weight room on a bi-weekly basis. So there was always a consistent way of collecting the data, like who was collecting it, what time were we collecting it, was it before practice, was it after practice, making sure we have really consistent data. And then the other thing in applying data, if a coach had a question for I don't know, maybe they're curious about what one specific player's workload looked like for the past few weeks. They just walk downstairs into my office and then ask me the question. I make a report for them, and then they can put it into action right then and there. So definitely much easier in the high performance model. Especially with data consistency is huge, and that's sort of one of the challenges of working with getting data for physical therapy clinics because of that inconsistent way of collecting different materials, different types of technology at different clinics, different types of people, all things that Daniel touched on earlier.
Gotcha. And I also wonder, Daniel, one of the things that physical therapists like to see is outcomes, because physical therapy is a very outcome-based discipline. And so when you implement a certain research protocol in a patient or for a patient, it's sometimes very hard to gauge the endpoint because there are a lot of variables. There is the variability of, is a patient willing to commit the time and effort to go through protocols, come in consistently. There's compliance with suggested physical therapy. So there's so many variabilities. I'm just wondering, from a physical therapist's mental thought process, when they bring a new concept into clinic, how do they validate whether or not it's working for a certain population it's supposed to work for? Now, obviously, in research, there's a control group, and it's very hyper focused, which allows you to collect enough data that validates its presence in a journal or a research paper. But to translate that into real world reality for a physical therapist, what is the mindset that therapist is going through? So Daniel, I know you are knee deep in research and technology, and you're constantly a sponge for this stuff. So you're probably like the ideal individual to ask, what goes through your mind when you come across a research concept, and when you implement it into clinic for a patient, what are you thinking? What gets you to reapply that concept for a longer period of time? Because I'm assuming it takes time and effort to see if that actually works in a patient or not.
Yeah, totally. It is much harder to standardize that outcome and see measure your progress or measure track if that intervention or new concept that you're working with is actually working. Um, I try to do it on a really micro basis with a day-to-day technique and try to get as objective as possible. We have patient-reported outcome measures that, to be honest, most people in the outpatient physical therapy world use those at the very beginning because insurance requires it, and you're like, I gotta fill this out, and then maybe you use it again at the discharge, and you kind of forget about it, or you tell your patient like, just rush through that, we'll get to that later, because it all becomes time, and that's time not spent with more patient facing uh, kind of intentions there. However, I think one of the things Lori Mishner, one of the mentors at USC for me, really encouraged us to do was to be more specific and try to be more objective with that kind of patient-reported outcome measure and use those specifically, even if that is something like a SANE score, a single single off a numeric evaluation, something like that, which is just from 0 to 100. How are you feeling today? Or 0 to 100, how does the function of your joint, or something like that. To be able to put a number behind what you're looking at and try to get a little bit more objective with that, at least so you have some way to kind of track these things. In our setting, it's super rare for that to be super objective and for you to realistically put those things into spreadsheet and do statistical analyses to see if your new research components are working. But at least having one little number on where you're going with that, and then having something to track, I think is a quick little way to start tracking that.
Gotcha. Shane, like in a professional sports setting, uh, when you when you have this sort of micro ecosystem of research going on, is any of that research ever published? I know that most teams are very guarded about how they train, how they rehab, how they recuperate players, because that's part of their secret sauce. And I feel like these professional teams are laboratories of experimentation that could deliver a lot of value for the general public, for the general physical therapist, because they can take a concept from research, apply it, and really find out what the results of that research really do. How does it impact an individual? Granted, the population group they're addressing is a very elite, 0.1% of the total population, but it still gives us a very good sort of petri dish. Um, do any of these teams ever publish any of the research that's being developed at the team setting?
Yeah, some do. I mean, like you said earlier, some teams are really protective, especially when you're talking about athletes' data. A lot of athletes are really protective of their data because I mean, they view it sometimes as something that can be used against them eventually. So there is some research published. I wouldn't say there's a ton out there, but definitely has been done before. But in terms for your comment on how we can translate that to PT. It does get a bit difficult, especially with the elite athlete level, because you're talking about people who are doing this as their job. They're working out in the morning, then they're going to practice for a few hours, and they have a dietitian on hand, and they have athletic trainers who are giving them recovery constantly. So very, very different environment.
Daniel, same question kind of for you, Daniel. Do you foresee clinics being able to generate interesting concepts that they then want to publish? Obviously, time is a big constraint. Uh, and with the same token, there are so many ideas generated within the clinic. I mean, I myself have been in clinics more than I care to count, but there are always cool ideas generated in the clinic, protocols that are being developed and tested. Do you do you see examples of clinics actually developing research within the clinic and then bringing it out to the public, either in a formal publication or more of an informal manner? I know you hinted at a couple of podcasts out there that are focused on bringing research ideas to the physical therapy population. But does it go the other way as well? Do clinics develop their own research that they then publish for the world to see?
Occasionally, I think that standardization, when you have real patients in front of you, probably messes with your actual data collection, and your, at least in my priority, is to help the patient in front of me, not to collect the cleanest data. So I don't know that we can always trust our data collection as much. However, if you end up with a large enough sample size, and getting a lot of people on there, some of that washes out some of our bias maybe, and gets you closer to a realistic number on there. I've seen a couple of examples of how people do this. Another one of my mentors in PT school was Todd Ellenbecker, who still is a very active researcher and active clinician, and is constantly doing some. We did some data collection in the clinic as well, to be able to publish that. But what I will say from someone like Todd is he's pretty rare, to be able to do that. I don't foresee most clinics kind of publishing their data and having the time to clean it and um, get that stuff out there.
So with research, I'm curious, when something is published in a research paper, the true validation of the concept comes in the clinic. Do you ever foresee a time where clinics can be used as a as a developmental arm to clarify whether a research idea is valid or not? So if you have, I think the US has 20,000 clinics, and let's say there's a research paper that comes out that suggests a certain protocol, and all 20,000 clinics start to use that protocol, they'll be getting some data. Obviously, the data isn't as clean as you'd get in a professionally done clinical study, but it gives you some realistic understanding and feedback on that concept. Do you foresee a way or a manner in which we can use these 20,000 clinics to validate ideas in research?
There's a potential there, and there's a potential if we standardize a little bit of what we're doing, but there's a lot of criticism in there as well. Of, if I do a jump on a force plate, um, and I always jump using my hands, and I call it a counter movement jump on that force plate, but technically in the counter movement jump metrics, you should be jumping with your hands on your hips. You don't know that that's being compared to hands on hips jumping for everybody, and it tells my patient, like, wow, you're in the 98th percentile of jump height for your age, with some stuff that, like, we're seeing from Vald, who's trying to do a really good job of this and taking their data that they have from force plate metrics all over the world. um, I'm not sure that I can trust that my patient is truly in the 98th percentile because I didn't know that I was actually doing it the correct way that they were talking about in their data collection. I think that there are certainly big companies like that, like Vault, who are trying to, and maybe with enough data points, we can get to the point where we can really trust those numbers. But they're certainly still taking some of those things with a grain of salt right now. Individual metrics as well also will change in their error rates. So if we're taking the force plate data, for example, something like concentric power, concentric impulse, probably impulse, total force over time. That metric tends to have around a 10% error rate or kind of coefficient of variance. It's normal for that metric to vary 10%. Something like rate of force development might have a much broader amount of variance in there. It might be 30, 40% that might vary within that. So you got to know which metrics you might be able to trust a little bit more to be a tighter spread, like concentric impulse, and which things that you might be like, I might not look at the quote unquote norms for this data for something like rate of force development.
Gotcha. Shayna, is there a potential for technology to impact what we're talking about from an AI perspective, software perspective? Do you foresee the future changing with the availability and the growth and sophistication of software and AI technologies out there to enable what we're talking about?
Yeah, I definitely think so, especially with the move for more physical therapy clinics to start collecting this data and to start learning a bit more about technology that they can use in the clinic. I think there's definitely a need for something that can track all of this as well, which is something we're working on actually, trying to um, build a software that collects all this data, collects specific things about the patient or participant you're working with, what phase of the injury are they in, what are their goals out of physical therapy? Do they just want to be pain-free or do they want to start running again? What tests are you using along the way, and what exercises are you using to address the issues that you're seeing in the tests? Basically our goal is to create a giant database that brings in all these metrics and then start to make some conclusions on like what's working, what isn't working. Maybe we're seeing trends in a specific injury metric, maybe we're not. So we're trying to take a like professional sport model and trying to apply that to physical therapy clinics.
Dan, I know you're very heavily involved in this as well, and I'll let you have the parting shot at the question as well.
Yeah, super excited for the ways that we can hopefully use some software tools to make this so much easier and more accessible for clinicians. I think Shayna comes from a world of professional sports where it becomes easier to get real data and to take that research that was done 3 months ago and put it into practice because you have Shayna working her butt off to get the team better and get them to doing it. Hopefully, with a lot of these kind of software tools, we can standardize that a little bit. But I'm not going to pretend that it's going to completely change the game and solve everything. It's still up to the clinician to consider all 3 points of that evidence-based triangle. But it certainly sounds a heck of a lot better than taking a measurement from my patient, going and looking up some research article, trying to pull the same kind of jump height measure, power measure, or something from there, and then compare it to the person in front of me. The point of all of this kind of stuff is making it a lot easier and simpler for clinicians to do these kinds of things. And if it can tell me, within 45 seconds, kind of where my patient lies with there, I'm much more likely to trust in that research and use that research on a daily basis because it took me 45 seconds and not 5 minutes. That is time is money. That's the most important thing, is making it easy on people.
Yeah, it seems like there's a general appetite for being able to do more of this. I think what you guys are working on is going to be pretty phenomenal once it rolls out in the next number of months. So with that, thank you both. This has been fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashmedh.